In the year 1807, Bavaria was a land cloaked in contradiction. To the outside world, it was a kingdom in bloom, reshaped by the seismic collapse of the Holy Roman Empire just a year before. Its rulers stood as symbols of Catholic faith and aristocratic refinement, draped in silks, walking the echoing halls of palaces filled with frescoes, gilded staircases, and symphonies of devotion to God and crown. But beneath this polished veneer of stability and divine order, something darker stirred. In candlelit chambers, behind velvet curtains and within the closed pages of guarded family records, secrets festered, secrets bound not only by political intrigue but by blood itself. Among the dynasties that stood proud in this age of uncertainty, the von Schönborns gleamed brightest, a family whose very name was intertwined with the church, with architecture, with wealth, and with devotion. They were not kings, but they wielded power akin to monarchs, serving as prince-bishops of Würzburg and Bamberg, shaping the spiritual and political course of entire regions. They built monumental palaces that stood as statements of eternal grandeur, intended to outlast centuries. Their portraits portrayed serenity, intelligence, and holiness. Yet the family's towering achievements concealed a fragility buried deep within their lineage, a fragility whispered about in corridors and hinted at in hushed courtly gossip. The year itself marked a turning point, not only for Bavaria but for families like the Schönborns. As Napoleon redrew the map of Europe with merciless precision, the structures of aristocratic authority cracked. The Schönborns, who had for generations relied on ecclesiastical dominance, suddenly found their influence shrinking. What once seemed eternal now felt precarious. And with the erosion of external power came an inward turn, a heightened obsession with legacy, bloodline, and the preservation of what they could control, the purity of their name. But purity comes with a price. To maintain their sacred position within the Catholic nobility, the Schönborns, like so many dynasties before them, turned to marriage arrangements within their own circles. Cousins wed cousins. Alliances were bound not across nations but within cloistered family branches. Such unions preserved wealth and reinforced loyalty, but in the unseen language of biology, they also sowed the seeds of decay. The very blood that upheld the dynasty's power began to betray it. Generations of selective unions tightened the genetic noose, creating whispers of frail heirs, unexplained illnesses, and children born too strange, too weak, or too silent to ever be paraded before the world. Imagine the candlelit halls of a Bavarian palace in this era. A noble child, born with a cleft palate or hydrocephalus, might be hidden from public view, baptized quickly, and committed to the silence of a monastery or convent. Records might list them as stillborn, though the truth was far more complicated. Another heir, blessed with intelligence but cursed by bouts of paranoia and melancholy, might be described in polite terms as delicate or unfit for worldly duties. These were not anomalies confined to the Schönborns alone. The entire web of European aristocracy grappled with the unspoken costs of inbreeding. But in 1807, as Bavaria stood at the crossroads of modernity and tradition, the Schönborn family embodied the contradiction perfectly. Powerful in history, but fragile in flesh. This contradiction is where their story becomes most haunting. To study the Schönborns of this era is to look at two histories unfolding at once: the public tale of opulence, piety, and monumental legacy, and the private story of frailty, genetic entrapment, and the silenced voices of children who never lived long enough to be remembered. It is a story that challenges the myth of dynastic invincibility and forces us to ask, how much of aristocratic history has been written on the backs of concealed tragedies? The allure of this investigation lies in peeling back those layers. For every towering cathedral financed by the Schönborns, there is a shadow of a hidden heir. For every resplendent portrait, there is the silence of the erased. And in the year 1807, with Europe convulsing under Napoleon's hand and Bavaria redefining itself, the Schönborns' secrets mirrored the instability of the age. They stood as both a symbol of continuity and as a dynasty slowly devouring itself from within. This is not merely the story of a single family. It is a window into a broader truth about power, legacy, and the dangerous price of purity. The von Schönborn dynasty becomes a case study in what happens when the hunger for control collides with the inescapable laws of biology. It is a reminder that beneath gilded ceilings and beneath the weight of titles lies something far more fragile: human blood, flawed and unforgiving. And so, as we begin to descend into the depths of their history, the curtain rises on Bavaria in 1807, a world glittering in candlelight, yet trembling with unspoken fears. What follows is not just a tale of architecture, politics, or faith. It is the story of a family whose greatest secret was carried not in their vaults, but in their veins. In 1807, Bavaria was not merely a region on the map of Europe, it was a land court between two worlds. On one hand, it was steeped in centuries of Catholic tradition, its villages and towns dominated by church steeples, processions, and festivals rooted in devotion. On the other, it was being thrust into the violent reshaping of Europe under Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had dismantled the Holy Roman Empire just a year earlier. The world that Bavaria had known, where dynasties like the Schonborns wielded both spiritual and temporal power, was collapsing. And with collapse came fear, but also opportunity. Bavaria itself was newly elevated. In 1806, through Napoleon's maneuvering, it became a kingdom, its ruler Maximilian I. Joseph crowned as king, aligning with France and stepping out of the shadow of the ancient empire. This was a moment of pride for many Bavarians, yet it also created turbulence. Long-standing noble houses, which had thrived under the old imperial order, suddenly found themselves stripped of influence. Their lands were reorganized, their privileges curtailed, and their ecclesiastical power, once the backbone of dynasties like the Schonborns, was steadily diminished. Amid this turmoil, Bavaria's cultural identity remained deeply rooted in Catholic faith. The church still commanded devotion at the village level, where peasants sought salvation through rituals and where saints were invoked to protect crops, cattle, and children. But Enlightenment thought was seeping into intellectual circles, bringing new questions about science, medicine, and reason. Physicians began to classify illnesses with more precision. Scholars questioned the supernatural explanations of madness or deformity. Yet superstition clung tightly to the countryside. A child born with a visible deformity might still be viewed as a curse, a punishment from God, or even a warning sign of sin committed within the family. For aristocrats like the von Schonborns, appearances mattered more than ever in this shifting world. Their identity was built on centuries of grandeur, opulent palaces, patronage of the arts, and service as prince-bishops and statesmen. In Würzburg, their monumental residence stood as one of the crowning achievements of Baroque architecture, a palace so magnificent that even today it commands awe. Such buildings were intended to symbolize permanence, to reassure subjects and rivals alike that the dynasty's strength was unshakable. But by 1807, this grandeur was a mask. The Schonborns and many of their peers faced a new and unsettling reality. Political structures had changed, power was no longer guaranteed, and behind the splendor lay vulnerabilities they could not so easily conceal. This is where the theme of bloodlines became so critical. Bavaria in this period was a land where noble families closed ranks. Marriages were strategic, often confined within tightly knit circles of Catholic aristocracy. To marry outside of that circle was to risk diluting power or, worse, betraying faith. But to marry within was to risk repetition of the same genetic combinations, generation after generation. In the eyes of nobles, this was not a flaw but a duty, a sacred responsibility to maintain purity. Yet in practice, this often translated into children born frail, sickly, or with conditions that baffled the limited medicine of the time. The political changes of 1807 only deepened this inward obsession. With external authority eroding, families like the Schonborns clung even harder to their inner world, where legacy was measured not just by land or titles but by whether heirs could be produced at all. This fixation created a paradox. Dynasties sought to strengthen themselves through selective unions, but in reality, they often weakened the very bloodlines they tried to protect. For Bavaria itself, this was also a moment of transformation. Towns were modernizing, roads improved under Napoleonic influence, and trade increased as old feudal barriers fell. Yet beneath the progress ran a current of unease. Families who had ruled for centuries were now reduced to symbols, their former power existing more in memory than in fact. The common people still looked upon them with awe, but also with whispers, tales of cursed blood, of noble children hidden from sight, of lineages that seemed unable to produce healthy heirs. The contrast between Enlightenment ideals and Catholic conservatism gave Bavaria in 1807 a unique tension. Physicians could explain some aspects of hereditary illness, but the true science of genetics was still more than a century away. To the nobles themselves, frailty or deformity was not seen in terms of chromosomes or recessive traits. It was interpreted as either God's will or a dangerous flaw to be hidden at all costs. Thus, the secrecy surrounding aristocratic families deepened, not only to preserve dignity but to maintain a public facade of divine blessing. In this landscape, the Schonborns occupied a peculiar place. Once among the most powerful ecclesiastical dynasties in Germany, they were now relics of a collapsing system. Their influence was fading, their palaces becoming symbols of a past age, yet they still carried the weight of centuries of expectation. Their wealth and reputation ensured that they remained visible, but their vulnerabilities, whether political or biological, were carefully guarded. To understand the Schonborns in 1807 is to understand a dynasty at a crossroads. They were products of a Bavaria undergoing rapid change, politically unstable, culturally divided between reason and faith, and socially obsessed with bloodlines. The contradictions of their world mirrored the contradictions of their family, majestic on the surface, but troubled underneath. And it was within this context that the darkest secrets of their lineage unfolded. The von Schonborn dynasty did not emerge suddenly in 1807. Their influence was centuries in the making. To understand the darkness behind their secrets, one must first grasp how their name became one of the most formidable in Bavaria and beyond. The Schonborns were not just aristocrats of wealth and land. They were a family that had mastered the delicate art of intertwining politics with piety, rising to prominence through both ambition and faith. Their power was born in the 17th century, flourished in the 18th, and by the dawn of the 19th had become legendary. Yet within that legend lay the seeds of fragility, as the very foundations of their success bound them to decisions that would later unravel their bloodline. The origins of the Schonborns trace back to Franconia, a fertile region of Germany dotted with vineyards, castles, and monasteries. From these landscapes emerged a family that would skillfully align itself with the Catholic Church during one of the most turbulent eras in European history, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. While Protestantism spread across much of northern Germany, the Schonborns stood firm with Rome, their loyalty rewarded with appointments to high ecclesiastical office. Unlike purely secular nobles, they became prince-bishops, men who ruled both as spiritual shepherds and as temporal lords. This dual power gave them control not only over souls but also over armies, land, and taxation. Few families wielded such influence. By the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s, the dynasty reached its golden age. Members of the family served as prince-bishops of Würzburg, Mainz, and Bamberg. One even became the Archbishop-Elector of Mainz, a position so prestigious that it carried the authority to crown emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. In this role, the Schonborn name became synonymous with the intersection of faith and empire, giving them a stature that rivaled kings. Their palaces and cathedrals reflected this grandeur. The Würzburg residence, often called the German Versailles, was their masterpiece, an opulent Baroque palace decorated with frescoes by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, one of the greatest painters of the age. Its sweeping staircases and painted ceilings were not merely architecture, they were declarations of divine legitimacy, monuments meant to cement the family's place in history. But while their palaces projected strength, the Schonborns' true strategy lay in the marriage bed. Aristocratic alliances were everything, and the family learned early that to maintain power they must control who entered their bloodline. They often married into other Catholic houses, many of them cousins or distant kin. These unions kept estates intact and ensured loyalty to the church, but they also narrowed the family's genetic pool. The Schonborns, like the Habsburgs, believed that purity of blood equated to purity of faith and strength of dynasty. In reality, each marriage tightened the noose of hereditary weakness, though no one in their time had the language of genetics to articulate it. Their obsession with lineage was visible not only in their alliances but in the way they chronicled their history. Family portraits lined their halls, each generation portrayed with an almost sacred reverence. Their archives meticulously recorded births, baptisms, and marriages, reflecting a dynasty that viewed itself as both chosen and eternal. Yet within those records were gaps, children who died too young, branches that mysteriously ended, names erased with careful inkstrokes. These silences spoke volumes. For all their public splendor, the Schonborns lived with the constant pressure of maintaining heirs, and not all heirs were fit to be displayed. By the 18th century, the dynasty had woven itself into the very fabric of European nobility. They were patrons of music, art, and education. Jesuits found ready allies in the family, and universities benefited from their endowments. To their contemporaries, the Schonborns embodied the Catholic aristocratic ideal, cultured, devout, and magnificently wealthy. But even as they reached these heights, their reliance on closed marital alliances was producing visible strains. Accounts whispered of Schonborn heirs prone to frailty, illness, or bouts of melancholy. Some lived short lives, others withdrew into religious orders, their potential quietly extinguished. To outsiders, these patterns were attributed to divine mystery or fate. To modern eyes, they reveal the unmistakable fingerprints of hereditary decline. The dynasty's roots in Franconia also tied them to land, particularly the vineyards that remain famous today. Wine was both an economic staple and a symbol of their connection to Catholic ritual. To drink of Schönborn wine was to partake in a legacy sanctified by the Church itself. Yet even this legacy carried irony. The fertile soil of Franconia could sustain vineyards for centuries, but the Schönborn bloodline, cultivated too narrowly, was already showing signs of exhaustion. By the dawn of the 19th century, the family had become a paradox. Their monuments stood as eternal symbols of stability, yet their lineage was fragile. They still possessed titles and wealth, but the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 stripped away much of their political power. What remained was reputation, tradition, and the weight of their name. The Schönborns were no longer the kingmakers of old, but they still carried the expectation of dynastic continuity. And it was here, in this expectation, that their secrets deepened. When we look back at the Schönborns' rise, it is easy to marvel at their accomplishments. Few families could boast such a legacy of art, architecture, and ecclesiastical authority. But beneath this triumph was an unspoken truth. Every alliance, every carefully arranged marriage, every effort to preserve their purity was also a gamble with fate. In their pursuit of eternal grandeur, they bound themselves to bloodlines that were finite, fragile, and destined to falter. Their story is one of dualities: sacred and profane, eternal and ephemeral, strength and weakness. The same family that crowned emperors and commissioned masterpieces was also the family that whispered of sickly heirs and concealed tragedies. To understand the Schönborns in 1807 is to see a dynasty at its zenith and on the brink of decline, a house that embodied both the glory and the curse of aristocratic ambition. Their palaces remain, their wine still flows, their name still carries echoes, but their blood carried a secret that could not be gilded or painted over. And in the years to come, that secret would begin to define them more than their triumphs ever could. In the world of European aristocracy, marriage was never a simple matter of love. It was a chess game played across generations, with pawns and queens chosen not for affection but for lineage, wealth, and faith. Nowhere was this more evident than in Bavaria at the dawn of the 19th century, and few families embodied this more intensely than the von Schönborn dynasty. By 1807, the Schönborns had already centuries of precedent guiding their decisions. Marry within your circle, preserve your estates, and above all, keep the bloodline pure. This cult of bloodlines, as modern historians might call it, was not unique to them. It was the unwritten law of Europe's noble class. But the consequences of this law were often far darker than the opulent weddings and alliances they produced. The aristocrats of this period lived in constant fear of dilution. Their wealth, lands, and titles had been built up over centuries, and to risk it all by marrying into an inferior family was unthinkable. For Catholic houses like the Schönborns, there was an additional layer of pressure: loyalty to Rome. Protestant alliances were off the table, and Catholic noble houses willing to marry into the Schönborns' orbit were limited. This narrowing of choice led, inevitably, to marriages between cousins, distant relatives, or branches of the same dynastic tree. What to modern eyes might appear reckless inbreeding was, to them, a sacred duty. This obsession with purity was not confined to the Schönborns. The Habsburg dynasty, Bavaria's powerful neighbours, had perfected the art of endogamy to such an extent that their most famous ruler, Charles II of Spain, became a grotesque caricature of genetic collapse. Born with the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity caused by generations of close marriages, Charles was so debilitated by illness, infertility, and mental decline that he became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He could barely chew food, struggled to speak clearly, and left no heirs, bringing the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs to an end. This cautionary tale was unfolding across Europe even as the Schönborns adhered to the same traditions, convinced that divine providence would protect them from such fates. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria, too, carried whispers of hereditary weakness. King Ludwig II, born a few decades later, would become infamous for his eccentricity and decline into madness. His cousin, King Otto, suffered from severe mental illness, spending most of his life secluded. These were not isolated incidents but symptoms of a widespread problem, dynasties tightening their bloodlines so firmly that the very traits they wished to preserve, beauty, intelligence, power, were undermined by the hidden mathematics of heredity. For the Schönborns, this practice created an aura of both privilege and peril. Their marriages were spectacles of wealth and piety, often celebrated in cathedrals built by their own ancestors. Brides entered their palaces adorned in silks and jewels, the union framed as a symbol of dynastic strength. But beneath the hymns and candlelight lurked an unspoken truth. These unions increased the likelihood of fragile heirs. Physicians of the time lacked the vocabulary of recessive traits or genetic disorders, but they saw the results. Children born with frailties, young nobles who wasted away before adulthood, heirs who were mentally unfit to manage estates. These patterns were noted, whispered about, and carefully concealed. The Schonborn family archives, like those of many dynasties, present a facade of continuity and success. Records detail births, baptisms, and marriages with pride. Yet between the lines are silences that speak volumes. A child recorded only as stillborn may have lived briefly but with a deformity too shameful to acknowledge. Another listed as entering a convent at a suspiciously young age may, in truth, have been deemed unfit for secular life due to illness or intellectual disability. The dynasty, like many others, practiced erasure as a survival tactic. By hiding their weakest links, they preserved the illusion of divine blessing. The cult of bloodlines also extended to how dynasties interpreted misfortune. A frail child was not seen as the result of hereditary narrowing but as a trial from God, a mystery of providence. A noblewoman who failed to produce heirs might be blamed for barrenness, her personal shame masking the reality of accumulated genetic weakness. Families clung to the belief that their faithfulness to the church would protect them, even as generations of cousin marriages tightened the net of illness around them. One of the most insidious aspects of this practice was the silence it demanded. Within aristocratic families, discussing hereditary weakness was taboo. To acknowledge it was to undermine not only reputation but the very system that ensured their power. And so, whispers replaced confessions, and gossip in rival courts became weapons. To accuse a noble house of tainted blood was both scandalous and devastating, a strike against their most sacred currency, legitimacy. The Schonborns were not immune to such whispers. Their rivals watched carefully for signs of frailty, and any hint of abnormality among their heirs could quickly become courtly rumor. The irony of this cult of bloodlines is stark. Dynasties believed they were safeguarding themselves by keeping marriages pure, yet in reality, they were building fragile houses of cards. The very strategy that secured their dominance led to the slow erosion of their vitality. For every grand wedding that cemented alliances, there was a hidden cost. Children whose lives were cut short, heirs unfit to rule, lineages quietly narrowing. By 1807, the Schonborn dynasty stood as a shining example of this paradox. Their palaces and cathedrals still gleamed with power, their names still commanded respect in Catholic Bavaria, yet behind closed doors their bloodline carried the burden of centuries of narrowed unions. They were not alone in this fate, but their decline was uniquely tied to the very ideals they had championed. Piety, purity, and preservation of lineage had brought them greatness, and simultaneously, they had sown the seeds of their undoing. Looking back now, with the lens of genetics, the pattern is undeniable. What the Schonborns believed was divine order was, in truth, a slow biological reckoning. And while they could silence gossip, erase records, and hide frail heirs, they could not escape the truth written in their very DNA. The cult of bloodlines, once the cornerstone of aristocratic strength, became the ghost that haunted every noble family portrait, every sealed archive, and every child who carried the invisible weight of history in their veins. The year 1807 marked a turning point not just for Bavaria, but for the von Schonborn dynasty itself. The world around them was collapsing and reshaping at a pace their ancestors could never have imagined. Napoleon's armies had shattered the Holy Roman Empire only the year before, sweeping away the centuries-old structures that had once guaranteed the Schonborns their authority. The ecclesiastical principalities, the prince-bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg, that had long been their domain were gone, absorbed into the new political order. For a family that had spent generations building its power through religious office, this was nothing short of catastrophic. Overnight, they found themselves stripped of much of the influence they had relied upon for centuries. On the surface, they remained wealthy and respected. Their palaces still stood as monuments to grandeur, their vineyards continued to produce fine wines, and their name carried echoes of past triumphs. Yet the reality was far less secure. In this new Napoleonic Europe, political authority no longer flowed through cathedral thrones or imperial coronations. It flowed through armies, treaties, and alliances dictated in Paris. For the Schonborns, whose greatest power had always been rooted in ecclesiastical office, the shift was devastating. Their role in the public sphere diminished, and with it, the illusion of invincibility began to crack. This was the climate in which family anxieties deepened. With their external power shrinking, they turned inward, clinging to the one thing they believed they could still control, the continuity of their bloodline. But here, too, the crack showed. Letters from the era, though carefully worded, betray concern. Heirs were scarce. Those who survived into adulthood often carried ailments that cast doubt on their ability to lead. Family records, often so detailed in chronicling triumphs, became curiously vague when addressing the fates of certain children. In some cases, names vanish altogether, replaced by silence. Behind closed doors, the Shunborns were facing a crisis of reproduction. Cousin marriages, once celebrated as clever alliances, had created an invisible trap. Heirs were fewer, and those that were born were more fragile. In an age where infant mortality was already high, aristocratic families had learned to expect loss. But among the Shunborns, the pattern went beyond chance. Too many children were weak, too many fell ill before reaching adulthood, and too many displayed signs of congenital conditions that baffled the physicians of the time. The dynasty's obsession with preserving itself had, ironically, begun to erode its future. The courtly world around them took note, even if indirectly. Rumors spread easily in the salons of Bavaria and Austria, where rival families watched each other closely. Whispered stories of Shunborn heirs who were delicate, frail, or unsuitable began to circulate. These euphemisms masked deeper fears, that the bloodline itself was failing. In aristocratic society, such gossip could be devastating. It not only undermined marriage prospects but also chipped away at the dynasty's aura of divine favor. For a family so tied to Catholic devotion, the suggestion of cursed or tainted blood carried dangerous implications. What made 1807 particularly ominous was that these private fears coincided with public decline. Without their bishoprics, the Shunborns no longer held the authority to deflect criticism with sheer political might. Their reliance on piety and grandeur felt increasingly hollow. The lavish churches they had built still inspired awe, but they now stood as monuments to a past that could not shield them from present troubles. The dynasty was becoming more a symbol than a power, and symbols are vulnerable to reinterpretation. Rivals could whisper of divine judgment, of God punishing the family for pride, even as physicians quietly noted hereditary weakness. Individual cases within the family added fuel to the fire. Contemporary accounts hint at members suffering from chronic illness, infertility, or nervous afflictions. Some withdrew from public life entirely, their absence explained by vague references to poor health or religious devotion. Others were married off in haste, desperate attempts to produce heirs that often failed. These were not isolated tragedies but part of a larger pattern, a dynasty caught in a biological decline that mirrored its political downfall. In the drawing rooms of their palaces, discussions grew tense. Every marriage had to be weighed with increasing care, but the options were limited. The pool of acceptable Catholic aristocrats was shrinking, and alliances outside it were unthinkable. Each union risked repeating the same genetic gamble. Each child carried the weight of not just one family's hopes but an entire dynasty's survival. And as the years passed, the outcomes grew more uncertain. The Shunborns' crisis of 1807 was, in many ways, the culmination of centuries of choices. Their rise had been built on loyalty to the church and the careful preservation of their bloodline. But the very structures that had sustained them, ecclesiastical power, dynastic purity, rigid tradition, had become their downfall. Napoleon had stripped them of the first, and nature itself was undermining the second. What remained was an illusion of stability, fragile as glass. This moment also reveals the profound irony of aristocratic survival. Families like the Shunborns believed themselves eternal, protected by both divine favor and careful planning. Yet their reliance on blood purity left them more vulnerable than they realized. For every grand portrait that celebrated their lineage, there was a hidden story of a child who did not survive, a marriage that failed to produce heirs, a silence carefully maintained to preserve dignity. The year 1807, then, was not just a date in their history, it was a symbol of their decline. The Shunborns still appeared powerful, still commanded respect, but the truth was harder to conceal. Their family tree was thinning, their heirs fragile, their political authority gone. What once had been a dynasty of bishops, builders, and kingmakers was now a house in crisis, clinging to its past even as its future slipped away. For the people of Bavaria, the Shunborns remained an object of fascination. Their name evoked grandeur, their palaces dazzled visitors, and their vineyards produced wine that flowed in both sacred and celebratory feasts. But behind the mask of opulence, the dynasty's secrets grew heavier. The hidden illnesses, the barren unions, the silenced heirs, these were the shadows haunting every candlelit corridor of their palaces. And in 1807, as the world changed around them, those shadows could no longer be ignored. The secrets of the von Schönborn dynasty did not always take the form of political maneuverings or whispered scandals in the courts of Bavaria. Some of the darkest truths were hidden much closer to home, in the nurseries of their palaces and the private wings of their sprawling residences. The family, like so many aristocratic dynasties of Europe, lived with the reality that not all children born into their lineage could be shown to the world. Behind the gilded portraits of healthy heirs and carefully staged family gatherings lay the existence of children who were quietly concealed, their lives overshadowed by frailty, deformity, or conditions too shameful to acknowledge publicly. These were the hidden children, erased from history not because they did not matter, but because they mattered too much to risk revealing. For aristocrats in the early 19th century, a child was not simply a son or daughter. It was the embodiment of lineage, the guarantee of continuity, the vessel of a family's hopes and prestige. Each noble birth was greeted with immense expectation. Yet when an infant was born with visible deformities, the celebration turned swiftly to silence. In such cases, the Schönborns, like their peers, resorted to strategies of concealment. Some children were declared stillborn even if they had lived briefly. Others were baptized in hurried ceremonies, their existence acknowledged only long enough to ensure salvation in the afterlife, before they were sequestered in monasteries, convents, or private quarters never to be seen again. Medical hindsight allows us to reconstruct the kinds of conditions that may have haunted the Schönborn nurseries. Inbreeding, with its narrowing of genetic diversity, is known to increase the risk of recessive disorders. Hydrocephalus, the accumulation of fluid in the brain leading to enlarged skulls, was one possibility. Another was cleft palate, a condition that, while treatable today, often led to feeding difficulties and early death in that era. Skeletal deformities, fragile bones, or congenital heart defects could also explain the recurring fragility of noble heirs. Each of these conditions would have been interpreted in the early 1800s not as a matter of biology, but as fate, divine will, or even a sign of God's displeasure. For the Schönborns, whose reputation was tied so closely to Catholic devotion, the presence of such children posed a profound dilemma. On the one hand, every life was sacred, and the Church demanded baptism and recognition of each soul. On the other, the public display of heirs was a cornerstone of dynastic legitimacy. A child with visible deformities threatened not only the family's pride but also its prospects of arranging future marriages and alliances. In this world, reputation was survival, and reputation depended on carefully curated images of health, strength, and divine blessing. Thus, the hidden children were sacrificed not in body, but in visibility. The practice of concealment was not unique to the Schönborns. Across Europe, noble houses perfected the art of erasing inconvenient heirs. The Habsburgs had their share of hidden offspring, some institutionalized, others written out of official genealogies. The French Bourbons quietly erased illegitimate or deformed children from court records. Even in Britain, whispers of aristocratic families hiding disabled heirs in remote estates or private asylums surfaced throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. What made the Schönborns' case especially haunting was how their obsessive devotion to Catholic morality intersected with this silence. They projected an image of sanctity, building churches and patronizing religious orders, even as they concealed their most vulnerable members in cloisters or erased them from family trees. The lives of these hidden children, though largely undocumented, can be glimpsed through patterns. A child born and lost within days or weeks, noted briefly in records without detail. Another vanishing from archives altogether, their existence remembered only in passing correspondence. Sometimes, a Schönborn daughter would be sent to a convent at an unusually young age, her calling explained as piety, though in truth it may have been a convenient way to remove her from public life due to physical or intellectual disability. Sons deemed delicate were sometimes placed in minor ecclesiastical roles far from the center of family power, their lives constrained by both circumstance and expectation. This culture of silence created layers of erasure. The parents themselves bore the grief of losing children, but grief was stifled by duty. The siblings grew up in an atmosphere where absence was rarely explained, and society at large, fed only carefully curated images, remained oblivious. The hidden children thus became ghosts within their own families, haunting presences whose absence was as carefully maintained as their existence had been concealed. The cruelty of this practice cannot be overstated. These children were not merely victims of biology but of an entire system that valued appearances above humanity. Their erasure was a symptom of the cult of bloodlines, the belief that noble families had a divine obligation to remain pure, even when that purity produced fragility. To acknowledge them would have been to admit weakness, to risk scandal, to expose the dynasty's most intimate flaw. And so, silence became survival. In Bavaria of 1807, the whispers of such concealments would have resonated powerfully. The Napoleonic Wars had destabilized society, and aristocratic families were clinging to relevance. Every misstep, every rumor, could be weaponized by rivals. Thus, the Schönborn's secrecy was as much a political strategy as it was a private choice. By hiding the children who did not conform to expectations, they preserved their public mask of strength and sanctity. Yet, ironically, the very act of concealment ensured that the truth, when it leaked in whispers, carried even greater power. Rumors of hidden deformities or frail heirs became scandalous fodder, their very secrecy lending them an air of dark authenticity. For modern historians, piecing together the fate of the Schönborn's hidden children is a difficult task. Official records are incomplete, deliberately so. But the patterns are clear: shortened lifespans, unexplained erasures, sudden entries into religious life. Combined with what we know of aristocratic inbreeding and its medical consequences, the evidence paints a chilling picture. The Schönborn dynasty, so devoted to preserving its bloodline, became a family shadowed by fragile heirs who could not be shown to the world. The image of their grand palaces, filled with frescoes, mirrors, and glittering halls, contrasts painfully with the reality of what was happening in private rooms. For every portrait of a healthy Schönborn heir painted to secure dynastic memory, there may have been another child, hidden, erased, or remembered only by grieving parents in silence. These children were the dynasty's most guarded secret. Their lives lived on the margins of visibility, their stories silenced so the Schönborns could continue to appear untarnished in the eyes of Bavaria and the Church. The hidden children reveal not only the cost of aristocratic obsession but also the human tragedy at its core. They remind us that behind every family tree carefully pruned for public display are branches deliberately cut away. And in the case of the Schönborns, those missing branches tell a story as haunting as any palace they left behind. Madness has always been one of history's most unsettling spectres, and in the world of aristocracy it carried a peculiar weight. For families like the von Schönborns, who had built their dynasty on Catholic devotion and the careful cultivation of reputation, whispers of mental instability struck at the very heart of their identity. A frail body could sometimes be hidden, a disfigured heir could be erased from records. But madness had a way of slipping through cracks, revealing itself in erratic behavior, scandalous decisions, or strange obsessions that could not easily be explained away. By the early 19th century, signs of mental and emotional fragility within the Schönborn line were becoming harder to ignore. To understand this, we must remember that in 1807, the science of mental illness barely existed. Physicians spoke in vague terms of melancholia, nervous disorders, or fits of mania. A nobleman prone to violent outbursts might be described as suffering from disturbed humours. A young woman lost in silence and depression might be said to have fallen under shadow. Treatments ranged from prayer and fasting to cold water immersions and bleedings, none of which addressed the root causes. To families like the Schönborns, such conditions were not understood in biological or psychological terms. They were framed as trials from God, punishments for sin, or even marks of spiritual sensitivity. The Schönborn archives, though sanitized, hint at heirs described as delicate in disposition or unsuited for worldly affairs. These euphemisms often concealed what we would now recognize as mental illness. Accounts of sleeplessness, sudden rages, or profound melancholy appear in scattered references. Some family members withdrew into monasteries or convents, their cloistered lives explained as religious devotion but likely driven by psychological struggles. In an era where public life demanded composure and dignity, even minor eccentricities could attract damaging attention. For a dynasty already weakened by inbreeding, such instability was especially dangerous. The broader European aristocracy provides chilling parallels. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, with whom the Schönborns frequently intermarried, would later produce King Ludwig II, remembered as the Mad King, whose erratic behavior and fantastical obsessions with castles and operas led to his deposition and mysterious death. His cousin, King Otto, was plagued by severe mental illness that left him unfit to rule. The Habsburgs, too, carried their own legacy of instability. Charles VI's descendants, for example, were marked by depression and hysteria. These families were not anomalies. They were the visible symptoms of what happened when generations of narrowed bloodlines concentrated not only physical disorders but psychological vulnerabilities. For the Schönborns, madness was a particularly dangerous threat because it was more difficult to control than physical frailty. A sickly child could be hidden, a deformed heir erased, But an adult nobleman suffering from paranoia or hallucinations could not be so easily confined without raising suspicion. Some were quietly dispatched to religious life, others sent to remote estates where their eccentricities could be managed away from the public eye. In certain cases, their instability may have even been reframed as holiness. Visions, raptures, or intense religious fervor could be interpreted as divine inspiration rather than psychological disturbance. In deeply Catholic Bavaria, this ambiguity provided a convenient mask, but it also blurred the line between faith and illness in unsettling ways. Descriptions of shunned family members in this period suggest patterns of melancholy, anxiety, and paranoia. These conditions were not random. They were part of a hereditary thread running through many aristocratic houses. Today, we might see the effects of inbreeding increasing the likelihood of disorders tied to fragile neurological development or the expression of recessive genes. In their time, however, such patterns were interpreted through the lenses of morality and spirituality. A melancholic heir was said to be pious, a paranoid one overly sensitive to the sins of the world. Yet beneath these rationalizations, the family surely knew the risks. They had seen too many heirs falter, too many lines weakened by frailty of mind as well as body. The silence surrounding mental illness also deepened the suffering. Unlike physical ailments, which at least elicited some measure of sympathy, madness carried stigma and fear. To be labelled insane was to be reduced to a shameful burden, unfit for leadership, unsuitable for marriage, and often stripped of rights. For noble families obsessed with legacy, this was devastating. The Schonborns may have concealed their afflicted members, but concealment came at the cost of isolation. Those suffering were cut off from their peers, hidden from society, their humanity overshadowed by the weight of dynastic reputation. In the salons and courts of Bavaria, gossip about noble madness was irresistible. Rivals seized upon rumors of instability to undermine families, casting doubt on their fitness to lead or to intermarry. For the Schonborns, whispers of delicate airs or eccentric behavior may have been amplified precisely because they had already lost so much political power after 1806. With their ecclesiastical authority stripped away, they could no longer shield themselves as effectively from scandal. Every hint of instability in their ranks became a potential weapon in the hands of rivals. The interplay of madness and faith created further complications. The Schonborns, known for their piety, might have framed certain symptoms as signs of mystical sensitivity. A young woman plagued by visions or compulsive fasting could be praised as a potential saint rather than pitted as a victim of obsession. A nobleman racked by paranoia about sin and damnation might be cast as zealously devout. These narratives offered the family a way to save face, but they also blurred the suffering of their members into narratives of sanctity, denying them recognition of their condition as illness. What emerges from these patterns is a chilling picture of how hereditary fragility expressed itself in the mind as well as the body. The Schonborns' narrowed bloodline carried not just the risk of deformities or frailty but also the invisible vulnerabilities of the psyche. Depression, paranoia, and other conditions may have haunted multiple branches of the family tree, each instance explained away or concealed, yet collectively forming a thread of decline. By 1807, this thread was tightening. The family's external authority was diminished, its heirs increasingly fragile, and its hidden children already a source of whispers. Madness, layered atop these burdens, became another shadow stalking their lineage. It represented the most intimate kind of vulnerability, the erosion of reason itself. For a dynasty that built its identity on control, dignity, and divine order, the possibility of hereditary madness was the ultimate threat, a revelation that their very blood might be cursed. The story of madness within the Schonborns is not simply about individuals who suffered. It is about the collision of biology, secrecy, and reputation. It is about how a family tried to mask the unmaskable, to cloak psychological fragility in the language of faith, to preserve dignity even as their heirs unravelled. And it is about how, in the silence of their palaces, the Schonborns confronted a truth they could never publicly admit, that power built on purity of blood was, in the end, power built on fragility. By the early 19th century, medicine was beginning to pull itself out of the fog of superstition and into the light of empirical observation. Physicians were classifying diseases, studying anatomy with greater rigor, and even beginning to make connections between heredity and illness. Yet the true science of genetics would not emerge until long after the Schonborns of 1807 had faced their decline. Today, however, with the benefit of modern understanding, we can return to their story and see with chilling clarity what was invisible to them. The fragility of their heirs, the hidden children, the shadows of madness, all of these were not random tragedies but the predictable consequences of inbreeding. This is where science meets mystery, the cold precision of genetics illuminating the secret weaknesses of a dynasty that once believed itself chosen by God. In simple terms, inbreeding occurs when individuals who are closely related reproduce. Each person carries 2 copies of every gene, one from their mother, one from their father. Many harmful genetic mutations are recessive, meaning that as long as only one copy is present, the individual may remain healthy. But when both parents carry the same recessive mutation, the chance of their child inheriting 2 defective copies rises dramatically. In small, close communities, or dynasties where cousins repeatedly marry cousins, the probability of this genetic doubling increases with every generation. What results is not simply one disorder, but a cascade of vulnerabilities, deformities, infertility, susceptibility to disease, and sometimes, mental instability. For the Schonborns, the risks were compounded by centuries of carefully controlled unions within Catholic aristocracy. The family's loyalty to Rome narrowed their marriage pool, restricting them largely to other noble Catholic houses that were themselves already practicing endogamy. Each generation concentrated the gene pool further, like wine distilled until it became both potent and poisonous. To their eyes, these marriages preserved holiness and legacy. To ours, they preserved recessive mutations. Consider the famous case of the Habsburgs, whose obsession with dynastic purity left its mark on the very faces of their rulers. The so-called Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that grew more exaggerated with each generation, was the visible result of centuries of inbreeding. Charles II of Spain embodied the biological collapse, infertile, mentally impaired, plagued by numerous ailments, and dead without heirs by the age of 38. His condition was not a curse but a genetic inevitability. The Schonborns, though less infamous, were playing the same dangerous game. Their hidden children, their frail heirs, their bouts of madness, these were all symptoms of the hereditary bottleneck they had created. Science also reveals why infertility became such a haunting spectre in aristocratic families. Inbreeding increases the likelihood of genetic conditions that impair reproductive health, from hormonal imbalances to malformed reproductive organs. Repeated cousin marriages concentrated these risks, producing dynasties where heirs were few and pregnancies often ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. For the Schonborns, whose survival depended on producing healthy male heirs to carry titles and estates, infertility was a silent plague. It was whispered about in courtly circles, concealed in letters, and blamed on individual women, when in truth the problem lay in generations of narrowed bloodlines. Equally chilling is the link between inbreeding and neurological disorders. Modern research has shown that certain forms of epilepsy, intellectual disability, and even severe psychiatric conditions can be more common in populations where close-kin marriages are frequent. The Schonborns' patterns of melancholy, paranoia, and religious obsession fit this framework all too well. What they interpreted as divine trials or heightened piety may have been symptoms of neurological fragility embedded in their very DNA. The scientific language we now possess casts a harsh light on what, in 1807, was shrouded in mystery. Hydrocephalus, cleft palate, hemophilia, skeletal deformities, these are conditions we can name and understand as genetic outcomes. But in the Schonborns' time, each was a terrifying enigma. A child with an enlarged skull might be thought bewitched. A boy who bled uncontrollably from minor wounds might be seen as cursed. A daughter prone to seizures might be interpreted as possessed or divinely touched. Without the framework of genetics, families like the Schonborns could only oscillate between superstition and silence. And yet, despite their ignorance of the science, they instinctively practiced concealment. They may not have understood recessive traits, but they understood patterns. They saw too many frail heirs, too many sudden deaths, too many silenced children. They knew something was wrong, even if they could not name it. Their response was to hide, to erase, to construct a facade of health and continuity while the truth of their lineage grew weaker. The intersection of science and secrecy is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Schonborn legacy. Today, we can see with precision what they could only feel as dread. Their decisions to preserve blood purity, born of devotion and ambition, created a genetic trap that no amount of piety could undo. They believed themselves blessed, yet biology was indifferent to blessing. Genes did not respect titles, wealth, or faith. The same laws that govern peasants in Bavarian villages govern the nobility in their palaces. The difference was that the peasants, mixing their bloodlines freely, diluted harmful mutations, while the nobles, jealously guarding their purity, concentrated them. In this way, science reveals a bitter irony. The very strategy meant to ensure dynastic survival ensured dynastic fragility. The Schönborn's obsession with continuity became the source of decline. Their devotion to purity created impurity of health. Their attempt to rise above ordinary humanity bound them more tightly to its most unforgiving laws. When we peer back through the lens of genetics, the mysteries of the Schönborn's hidden children and troubled heirs cease to be inexplicable. They become case studies in hereditary decline, cautionary tales of what happens when ambition and faith ignore biology. But the human tragedy remains. Behind every medical explanation lies the life of a child erased, a parent grieving in silence, a dynasty haunted by what it could not admit. Science may solve the mystery, but it cannot erase the sorrow. For the Schönborns of 1807, the science we now know did not exist. All they had were whispers, fears, and the fragile hope that the next marriage, the next child, might restore their strength. For us, their story is a reminder of how easily power and bloodline can unravel under the weight of biology. And it is a reminder that the secrets they buried in silence were not merely scandals of reputation but the early echoes of genetic truths that would only be understood centuries later. Religion was the shield of the von Schönborn dynasty, and in Bavaria of the early 19th century, Catholic devotion was more than faith, it was political armor. The Schönborns had built their entire legacy upon it. They were not merely aristocrats, they were prince-bishops, men whose authority was sanctified by Rome itself. Their palaces and cathedrals were statements of piety and permanence, reminders that their power was inseparable from a church. But by 1807, as the dynasty's foundations began to tremble under the weight of political change and hereditary decline, religion became less a calling and more a mask, a carefully maintained illusion that concealed weakness beneath a veneer of sanctity. The Schönborns had long cultivated an image of holy stewardship. They financed churches, endowed monasteries, and supported the Jesuit order with almost obsessive devotion. Their grandest creation, the Wurzburg residence, was more than a palace. It was a temple to Catholic power, its frescoes depicting heavenly order descending into earthly authority. Visitors walking its halls were meant to see not only wealth but divine blessing, the proof that God favored the Schönborn name. This reputation was carefully guarded, for in a Catholic kingdom, sanctity and authority were inseparable. To question one was to undermine the other. Yet this image was increasingly out of step with reality. The collapse of the Holy Roman Empire had stripped the Schönborns of the prince-bishoprics that had defined them. Without those offices, their role as guardians of Catholic Bavaria was diminished. They clung to their devotions more tightly than ever, pouring money into religious projects and parading their piety as proof that their dynasty still mattered. But behind the gilded altars and the sacred processions, the family was haunted by secrets, frail heirs, hidden children, whispers of madness. Religion became a mask, a way of projecting order when their bloodline was unraveling in silence. This mask was not unique to the Schönborns. Across Europe, aristocratic families used religion as a shield against scandal. In Spain, the Habsburgs framed their hereditary deformities as evidence of holy suffering, turning biological weakness into a kind of sanctity. In Austria, devout practices and extravagant church patronage disguised dynastic decline. For the Schönborns, the strategy was similar. Every cathedral they built, every donation they made, every procession they sponsored was an attempt to remind the world that their family was chosen by God, regardless of what shadows lurked behind palace doors. But devotion also carried contradiction. Catholic teaching emphasized the sanctity of all life, yet aristocratic practice demanded silence about heirs who did not conform. A Schönborn child born with deformities would be baptized, but then quietly hidden, their existence rarely acknowledged again. In the eyes of the Church, this was still salvation. In the eyes of society, it was concealment. This tension between theology and reputation created an atmosphere of profound hypocrisy. The family that financed Jesuit schools and built monasteries was the same family that erased its weakest children from history. Their faith was genuine in one sense, but instrumental in another, an indispensable tool for preserving power while avoiding accountability. Piety also provided a convenient explanation for instability. A Schönborn heir plagued by visions, paranoia, or melancholy could be described as blessed with sensitivity to the divine. A daughter prone to seizures or compulsive fasting might be hailed as touched by sainthood. These narratives transformed potential scandal into spiritual mystique. What modern medicine would interpret as neurological or psychological illness could be reframed as holy fervor, protecting the family's reputation while denying the true suffering of the individual. Religion, in this way, did not just shield the Schönborns, it reinterpreted their fragility as sanctity. In the courts and salons of Bavaria, this mask was effective, but not impenetrable. Rivals whispered about tainted blood, about cursed heirs, about dynastic weakness disguised as piety. Every act of religious generosity was seen by some as overcompensation, an attempt to buy legitimacy from God and men alike. The more the Schonborns leaned into their identity as Catholic patrons, the more it revealed their desperation to preserve a legacy threatened by both political irrelevance and biological decline. The irony is stark. The Schonborns, who gave so much to the Church, found themselves trapped by the very ideals it promoted. The Catholic insistence on purity, on continuity, on divine order mirrored their obsession with bloodlines. Both faith and biology demanded perfection, and both punished deviation. When their heirs faltered, the family could not simply admit the truth. They had to wrap it in religious justification or erase it altogether. Their devotion became a prison as much as a shield, binding them to expectations no dynasty could ever truly fulfill. By 1807, their religious identity was as much performance as belief. They still built churches, still sponsored saints' festivals, still poured money into sacred art. But the true purpose of these acts was no longer spiritual renewal, it was survival. The Schonborns were struggling to convince Bavaria, and perhaps themselves, that they were still chosen, still strong, still favored by heaven. Yet every hidden child, every whispered rumor of madness, every fragile heir undermined that illusion. Religion offered them a mask of sanctity, but beneath it their dynasty was bleeding out, undone not by heresy or sin but by the relentless mathematics of their own blood. In the end, the Schonborns' piety was both genuine and strategic, both heartfelt and hollow. It was a faith that inspired them to create monuments of beauty, but also a mask that concealed tragedy. Their churches still stand today, their frescoes still inspire awe, their name still echoes with reverence. But behind every altar they built, behind every prayer they offered, lay the unspoken truth, that their devotion could not save them from the secrets buried in their veins. Religion was their greatest strength, but also their most elaborate disguise. In the glittering courts of Bavaria and Austria, where chandeliers illuminated silk gowns and powdered wigs, gossip was as powerful as any treaty. Aristocratic families survived not only through wealth and alliances but through reputation, an invisible currency that could determine who married whom, who was trusted with land, who rose to power, and who faded into obscurity. By 1807, the von Schonborns were no longer the towering figures they had once been. Their political power had waned with the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, but their names still carried weight. And because of that, their rivals and peers watched them closely, seizing upon any crack in the dynasty's carefully constructed image. What emerged was a murmur that refused to be silenced, whispers of infirmity, infertility, and tainted blood. Scandal in aristocratic circles often began quietly. A rumor about a child who had vanished from records. A hushed comment about a marriage that had failed to produce heirs. An observation that a Schonborn heir seemed unusually fragile, pale, or eccentric. Such whispers spread quickly in drawing rooms, carried on the breath of servants, courtiers, and discontented rivals. Unlike official decrees or letters sealed with wax, gossip needed no proof, it thrived on suspicion. And in an age when lineage determined destiny, suspicion was enough to tarnish a family's future. The Schonborns' devotion to Catholicism gave them an aura of sanctity, but it also sharpened the edge of rumor. Any sign of hereditary weakness could be reframed as divine punishment, a judgment from God for arrogance or hidden sin. Rivals who coveted their lands or influence had every reason to fan the flames of such interpretations. A frail Schonborn child was not just a personal tragedy, it became evidence of a cursed lineage. An heir whose behavior was erratic might be described not as melancholic but as touched by madness, a dangerous label in a society where leadership demanded reason and dignity. Infertility was one of the most potent sources of gossip. In a world where dynastic survival hinged on heirs, a marriage that failed to produce children was both a scandal and a threat. Within the Schonborn dynasty, alliances were often sealed with high expectations, but when years passed without offspring, whispers of barrenness or sterility spread through the courts. Women bore the brunt of the blame, their reputations destroyed by accusations that were, in reality, often the consequence of hereditary weakness on both sides. Rival families weaponized these failures, painting the Schonborns as a line incapable of sustaining itself. Court painters and portraitists added their own subtle contributions to the rumor mill. Every noble face painted was scrutinized not only for beauty but for signs of vitality. A Schonborn heir with a weak jaw, sunken eyes, or an unsteady stance could ignite speculation. These details, often exaggerated in private retellings, reinforced the narrative of decline. A single portrait could spark years of whispered commentary, especially when compared to the more robust visages of rival dynasties. Letters from contemporaries hint at such gossip, couched in polite euphemisms. Words like delicate, eccentric, or unfit appear again and again, polite masks for far darker suspicions. What was said in letters was even sharper in salons, where aristocrats relished tearing down their rivals under the guise of concerned observation. A shonborn rumoured to be withdrawn or melancholic might quickly become the subject of tales of madness. A marriage delayed or broken off was assumed to be the result of secrets too shameful to be acknowledged openly. The power of gossip lay not only in its content but in its ability to shape perception. Once a rumour took root, it coloured every action of its target. If a shonborn heir stumbled at a public ceremony, it became proof of frailty. If a bride delayed her pregnancy, it became proof of infertility. If a noble retreated to religious life, it was taken as confirmation of instability. In this way, gossip created its own reality, one that could not be countered by wealth or architecture. Even the grandest palaces could not silence the murmurs that crept through their halls. The shonborns fought back with piety and spectacle. They financed festivals, patronized artists, and hosted elaborate religious ceremonies to remind Bavaria of their enduring sanctity. Yet these very displays were sometimes interpreted as overcompensation. Why, rivals whispered, did the shonborns give so much to the church unless they were trying to distract from weaknesses within their bloodline? The louder their public devotion, the darker the private rumours became. One particularly cruel form of gossip was the claim of cursed blood. This phrase surfaced often in aristocratic circles, used to describe dynasties plagued by repeated misfortune. For the shonborns, whose hidden children and frail heirs were known at least in fragments, the label stuck. The idea of a divine curse was both scandalous and persuasive in deeply Catholic Bavaria. It provided a narrative that explained every tragedy, every early death, every whispered secret. A family once seen as blessed by God could just as easily be recast as judged by him. Scandal also shaped marriage prospects. Rival families, wary of binding themselves to a declining bloodline, sometimes rejected shonborn alliances under the guise of other excuses. Behind closed doors, however, the reasoning was often the same. The risk of marrying into fragility, of introducing tainted blood into their own lineage, was too great. Every rejected proposal reinforced the narrative of decline, isolating the shonborns further and deepening their dependence on marriages within their own shrinking circle, a cycle that only worsened their hereditary risks. The shonborn story reveals how gossip was not idle chatter but a weapon of survival and destruction. It served political ends, undermined dynasties, and reshaped the future of families that had stood for centuries. For the shonborns in 1807, scandal was not merely a background murmur, it was a force that amplified their decline, ensuring that their private struggles became public liabilities. What is most haunting is how little was needed to sustain these whispers. A missing name in a baptismal record, a pale face in a portrait, a barren union, a nervous breakdown, each fragment was enough to weave a story. And once woven, these stories lingered, becoming part of the dynasty's identity whether they were true or not. By the time the shonborns entered the 19th century, their name was caught between two realities, the grandeur of their past and the whispers of their present. Their palaces proclaimed eternal glory, but their rivals whispered of weakness. Their churches testified to sanctity, but gossip insisted on cursed blood. The dynasty's greatest achievements could not silence the low, persistent hum of scandal that stalked them in every ballroom, every salon, every shadowed corridor of aristocratic Europe. The story of the von Schönborns after 1807 is not one of dramatic collapse but of a slow, almost imperceptible fading, a dynasty that once shaped kingdoms and crowned emperors gradually becoming a relic of a bygone age. Their decline was not marked by a single catastrophic event but by a steady erosion of influence, generation after generation. What made this decline so haunting was its dual nature. While their palaces still glittered and their vineyards still bore fruit, their family tree was withering, its branches thinning, its heirs growing fewer and frailer with each passing decade. The loss of ecclesiastical power in 1806 had been the first great blow. The Schönborns had built their authority on the prince-bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg, offices that gave them both religious and political command. When Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, those territories were absorbed into the new kingdom of Bavaria, and the Schönborns' role as spiritual princes ended abruptly. From that point forward, their influence was increasingly symbolic. They remained wealthy landowners, patrons of the church, and respected nobles, but they were no longer kingmakers. Their destiny shifted from shaping the course of empires to preserving the memory of what they once had been. The 19th century was an era of transformation across Europe. Nations modernized, the middle class rose, and revolutions shook the old order. Aristocratic families that had once seemed eternal found themselves sidelined, their privileges dismantled piece by piece. The Schonborns, bound to tradition and weakened by hereditary fragility, struggled to adapt. Their estates, though vast, required careful management, and their reliance on ecclesiastical prestige left them unprepared for the realities of the new political order. Unlike merchants or industrialists, they could not reinvent themselves. Their identity was too deeply tied to the past. Yet outwardly, their grandeur persisted. Visitors to Wurzburg could still marvel at the residence, with its sweeping staircases and monumental frescoes. The Schonborn vineyards continued to produce wines prized across Europe. Their patronage of the church ensured that their name remained woven into the fabric of Catholic Bavaria. But beneath this brilliance, the family was shrinking. Heirs were fewer, marriages produced fewer children, and rumors of frailty and madness persisted. In their palaces, long corridors filled with portraits of ancestors testified to centuries of triumph, but the living heirs who walked those halls seemed increasingly pale echoes of the figures on the walls. The decline was also visible in their family tree. Branches that once flourished began to wither, with lines ending abruptly for lack of heirs. Some Schonborn children died young, their names erased or softened in records. Others entered religious life, effectively removing themselves from dynastic continuity. Marriages often failed to produce the robust families needed to sustain a house of such stature. Each missing generation, each childless marriage, weakened the dynasty's grip on the future. By mid-century, their lineage resembled not a flourishing oak but a thinning vine, its roots deep but its shoots fragile. The contrast between their monumental architecture and their fragile heirs became increasingly stark. The Wurzburg residence, with its magnificent fresco of heaven spilling into the earthly realm, was designed to symbolize permanence and divine favor. Yet by the 1800s, it felt more like a mausoleum to past glory than a home for a thriving dynasty. The palaces remained, but they no longer reflected vitality. They stood as silent witnesses to decline, their grandeur mocking the fragility of the family within. In society, the Schonborns were gradually redefined. Once feared and respected as powerful prince-bishops, they became relics, symbols of a vanished age of ecclesiastical aristocracy. Their role shifted from rulers to hosts, from statesmen to patrons. They still held wealth and prestige, but they were no longer central to the currents of history. Other families, other powers, rose in their place, while the Schonborns clung to the memory of what had been. This transformation was not unique to them, but their decline was sharpened by the hereditary weaknesses that made their survival more precarious than most. The 19th century was also a time when whispers of hereditary decline carried greater resonance. As medicine advanced, physicians began to note patterns of illness and fragility in certain families. While the full science of genetics was still a century away, the idea that some lineages were biologically weaker gained traction. For the Schonborns, who already carried the burden of rumor, this was dangerous. The very traits they had sought to conceal, infertility, madness, deformity, were increasingly interpreted as hereditary, not divine mysteries. Their secrets, once cloaked in religion and silence, began to take on the shape of scientific inevitability. Yet it would be wrong to imagine the Schonborns vanishing entirely. Their name endured, their estate survived, and their legacy as patrons of art and architecture remained secure. But their prominence diminished, their bloodline thinned, and their place in the aristocratic hierarchy slipped quietly down the ladder. By the later 19th century, they were no longer players in the great game of European power but respected relics, their story more a subject for historians than for diplomats. What makes their decline so haunting is its quietness. There was no dramatic downfall, no revolution that destroyed them outright, no scandal that obliterated their reputation. Instead, there was a slow fading, a steady erosion of vitality that mirrored the very genetic weaknesses they had cultivated through inbreeding. Their palaces stood strong, but their heirs grew weak. Their vineyards flourished, but their family tree faltered. Their name endured, but its meaning shifted from power to memory. The slow fade of the Schonborn dynasty reveals the paradox at the heart of aristocratic obsession with bloodlines. They built their greatness on purity, and purity became their undoing. They sought eternity through continuity, and continuity produced fragility. Their decline was not a failure of wealth, nor even of politics, but of biology itself. And so, as the 19th century unfolded, the Schonborns became living symbols of a truth no dynasty could escape. Power may build palaces, faith may inspire cathedrals, but blood carries its own secrets, and no amount of devotion or grandeur can silence them forever. The legacy of the von Schönborn dynasty is a paradox, an inheritance of splendor and fragility, of cathedrals and silence, of faith and failure. To walk through the Wurzburg residence today, gazing up at the largest fresco ever painted, is to feel the weight of a family that once seemed destined to last forever. Their palaces, vineyards, and churches remain, tangible reminders of centuries when the Schönborn name commanded reverence across Bavaria and beyond. And yet, the dynasty that built these monuments was undone not by enemy armies or political treachery but by the quietest of forces, their own blood. When we look at the Schönborns with the hindsight of modern science, their story becomes painfully clear. Centuries of endogamy, marriages confined to cousins and close Catholic allies, had concentrated recessive traits until fragility became inevitable. The hidden children, the heirs lost to illness, the whispers of madness, all were symptoms of genetic narrowing. What they interpreted as divine mystery was, in truth, biology at work, indifferent to their faith or their ambition. The family that built monuments to eternity had built fragility into its very veins. Yet their decline was not merely biological. It was cultural, political, and psychological. The collapse of the Holy Roman Empire stripped them of the ecclesiastical offices that had defined them. No longer prince-bishops, no longer kingmakers, they became relics of a vanished order. Their wealth preserved them, but wealth could not restore the authority they once wielded. Their religious devotion, once a source of strength, became a mask to conceal weakness. Their palaces, once symbols of triumph, became mausoleums to a grandeur already fading. What lingers most hauntingly is the silence that surrounded their secrets. The hidden children who were baptized and then erased. The frail heirs described only in vague euphemisms. The melancholy, paranoid, or eccentric members recast as pious visionaries. Every omission in their records, every gap in their portraits, every carefully phrased letter reveals a family that understood its fragility but could not acknowledge it. Their silence was survival, but it was also erasure, an erasure that speaks louder now than their boasts ever did. The legacy of the Schönborns forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about aristocracy itself. Dynasties across Europe followed the same path, believing purity of blood was strength when in fact it was decay. The Habsburgs produced rulers so deformed and impaired they could not govern. The Wittelsbachs descended into madness. The Bourbons concealed children born with defects. The Schönborns, though less infamous, were part of the same pattern, a reminder that power built on narrow bloodlines was doomed to collapse. Their story is not unique, but it is emblematic, a microcosm of a wider European tragedy. And yet, even as their lineage faltered, their cultural and artistic legacy endured. The palaces and cathedrals they built remain some of the greatest achievements of the Baroque age. Their vineyards still produce wine. Their name still evokes a certain reverence in Bavaria. In this sense, they achieved a kind of immortality, not through blood, but through stone and art. But the irony is sharp. The very monuments meant to celebrate their eternal vitality now serve as reminders of a dynasty that could not escape decline. They stand as ghosts of grandeur, haunted by the fragility of the blood that built them. The legacy of the Schönborns also speaks to a universal human truth. Power cannot silence biology. Faith cannot rewrite heredity. Wealth cannot buy immunity from the laws of nature. For all their achievements, for all their sanctity, the Schönborns were subject to the same genetic rules as the peasants who work their fields. In fact, their obsession with purity made them more vulnerable than those they ruled. The peasants mixed bloodlines freely, diluting recessive traits. The nobles, desperate to remain apart, trapped themselves in hereditary loops that magnified their weaknesses. Their downfall was not a failure of fortune but of strategy, a miscalculation repeated across Europe's aristocracies. There is a chilling poetry in the idea that the Schönborns' greatest secret was not political, but biological. That behind the walls of their palaces, behind the frescoes and the altars, the most dangerous truth was carried in their very veins. That truth could not be painted over, prayed away, or concealed forever. It lingered in frail bodies, in fragile minds, in the thinning branches of a family tree that once seemed so strong. Today, when we speak of the Schönborns, we remember the art, the architecture, the wine, the devotion. But beneath these achievements lies the shadow of what was lost, the children erased, the heirs who never ruled, the dynasty that dwindled even as its monuments endured. Their legacy is both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that behind every golden facade lies a human story marked by fragility. The lesson of the Schönborns is larger than their family. It is a warning about the dangers of obsession with purity, whether of blood, faith, or legacy. It shows us that attempts to preserve power through insularity often lead to decline. It reminds us that silence, though it may protect reputation in the short term, cannot conceal truth forever. And it forces us to ask how many dynasties, how many empires, how many families across history have been built on the same fragile foundations, their secrets buried with their dead. As the candles burned low in the Schönborn palaces of 1807, as heirs weakened and political authority slipped away, the family clung to its sanctity, its art, and its name. They could not know that history would remember not only their achievements but their decline. They could not know that the frescoes they commissioned would one day be read not as proof of divine blessing but as haunting counterpoints to their fragility. They could not know that their silence would echo louder than their prayers. And so their story ends not with a grand collapse, but with a lingering question. How many dynasties have hidden their most vulnerable children, erased their most painful truths, and built their legacies on blood already cursed? The Schönborns remind us that history is not only what is written, but what is concealed. Their monuments remain, but their true legacy lies in the shadows, the legacy of a family undone by the very purity it sought to preserve.